You are listening to Not Another Comic Book Podcast, Episode 4, where we discuss X-Men Mutant Genesis, The Punisher by Greg Rucka, and Ninjak, Volume 1, Weaponeer. Settle in, hang out, and let's talk comics.
This is Not Another Comic Book Podcast, the show dedicated to hanging out and talking about comics with your hosts, Nick.
No, I get to be the hero. That sounds great.
Hoover.
There's a good story in this comic, and it's everything they didn't tell us.
And Captain Ryan.
Until there's a mutiny, and they throw me overboard.
Now, on to the show.
Welcome to Not Another Comic Book Podcast. I am, of course, joined in studio tonight by Mr. Brian Huber.
Yay! Let's have some fun with this one. We got 3 good comics at least this time, so...
Safe.
And joining us from the magical properties of the interwebs, the valiant variant himself, Mr. Nick Wilson. How are you tonight?
I'm pretty good. And this evening, we have our first Valiant comic. So that title is even more appropriate this time. So
it was probably about time.
Yeah. I'm doing great. Thanks to everybody who's been checking the podcast out. Appreciate it. Excited for another Saturday night.
And to all those listening, thank you for joining us. If you are wanting to catch up to the current episode and are just joining us, you can find us on Spotify, YouTube, and most other streaming platforms. And if you just can't get enough of us in your life and you need more, you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and of course the Facebook group, Comic Book Hangout. This evening, we are reading and reviewing Punisher, Mutant Genesis with X-Men, and correct me if I pronounce this horribly, Ninjak.
Oh, that's correct.
All right. I did something right. Starting us off for the evening, Mr. Hoover, what did you pick for the week?
So this week I decided to go for a comic that I'd been thinking about recently, which was... It's a bit of a rarity because this is one time where an original author gets to actually kind of redo some stuff that he did over a very long run. So my first pick is X-Men 1. This is 1991. Jim Lee and Chris Claremont were tasked with trying to bring things back to the norm. Bring everything back to, like, Magneto being a villain, bringing Xavier back, because up until this point, on the Claremont run, Xavier hadn't been with the X-Men for a decent amount of time. Magneto had been running the X-Men / New Mutants. The rosters got extremely expanded. So this was kind of an attempt to not only make more comics, of course, because this was the 90s and we were getting into the scary territory of comic books where everything got a comic, but it was their attempt to bring everything back to the normal. This is probably, if you know X-Men, this is probably the most known version of X-Men. This is where, you know, the cartoon comes from. Everyone kind of knows this story to an extent. I think the funny thing is I really find with this one is this is also the highest selling comic, but it also was kind of the start of one of the more unliked parts of comics in which variant covers became the norm. Because this one had about 5 different variant covers at the beginning, and I think 3 more later during reprints. The really weird part about this, though, is you can't really tell who was doing the main writing of this. Jim Lee and Chris Claremont, if you ever watched the Claremont documentary, you can tell that they were kind of feuding about the direction of this with editors. I'm not sure who to give credit for this comic book, but I actually think, even though it was kind of a dysfunctional relationship, that they actually did a really good job of getting it going. So basically it takes part as Magneto, which a lot of this wasn't explained in comics, but Magneto had left the leadership of the X-Men and Xavier had returned. Magneto had went back to an asteroid that had been destroyed previously, but is somehow back or remade or something. And has been living his life in secret. basically alone, removed himself from the world. I think what this comic really does great is, and give credit to Claremont's run of actually developing Magneto from a villain to a hero, is when he goes back to his villainous ways, he's a much better character. He has there's a lot more sympathy for the character. So basically what happens in this is a few mutants are running from one of the governments, I can't remember which one, but ended up trying to get to Asteroid M to find salvation there. During this conflict, a couple of the mutants were killed, and kind of throws Magneto back to his original thing of, I need a deterrent. But one thing that they especially done really well in the first couple of comics is they bring up older things in Magneto's past. So when he needs a deterrent, he goes back to a sub that he had sank a long time ago. And they do a really good job showing basically the death and destruction that he used to cause and working his way back there. But it also does a really good job of keeping the relationships intact. Because Xavier had been running the X-Men for so long, minus Cyclops, most of the X-Men already have a very friendly, a very respectful relationship with them. I mean, this is where Rogue and Magneto have a lot of back history. This is where, like, in Age of Apocalypse, that backstory was how they came up with the Rogue and Magneto marriage in Age of Apocalypse. The art is done by Jim Lee, which I'm not going to say Jim Lee has the best art, but he is probably my favorite artist simply because what he draws is what I expect comics to look like from the age that I'm from. So it's extremely clean. It's somewhat realistic, but it has a cartoonish look to it. The colors are extremely bright. I do want to point out that Wolverine is still in his brown and yellow costume, which is, in my opinion, the better costume. I like the yellow and blue, but this one actually seems a bit more realistic.
I agree.
I mean, this is also the start where to deal with the problem with too many X-Men, they started going with the multiple teams. So this is where the gold and blue starts. This is where Storm and Cyclops both have a team to work with. So the comic starts off basically with a simulation of one group of X-Men trying to get into the mansion to kill Xavier. The back and forth on this is actually pretty good. I mean, it's got a decent... One thing Jim Lee was really good at, especially in the 90s, were the fight scenes. His comics were extremely explosive and a lot of action. A lot of his dialogue happens while fights are happening. They do a really good job switching between the teams going through there. I mean, it's got the weird X-Men stuff like cyborgs in the Danger Room and all this other stuff. One of the things I really like about it is, for the longest time, we hadn't had that Wolverine Cyclops frenemy stuff in a long time. And of course, Wolverine's the one who gets to Xavier. And when he pops the claws close to Xavier, Cyclops just blows his lid. And, classic Wolverine Cyclops. Xavier was never in any harm, but Cyclops doesn't like any of the things that Wolverine does. But Jean does, which I found hilarious, as you see her in the background smirking. But so it quickly goes from there to back to Magneto. So Magneto took in both these groups of humans and mutants who were heading to Asteroid M. Once again, still trying to not have a violent solution to it. That's the one thing I do like about this Magneto. He really isn't trying to get back into his old ways, but he just keeps getting pushed. So you get to that, and one of the humans ends up killing one of the mutants who was running towards Magneto for help. And that was kind of like the first glimpse of Magneto really saying, we need to get back to this. After that, of course, we get the first fight with him and the X-Men, which is during the submarine problem, which it's never good when he goes to go get nukes. Whenever Magneto's like, I need nukes. It's always
never good.
Quite badly, but I really like this confrontation because you can tell that there's still... Magneto's extremely angry, but they're still friends right now. There's still a lot of people that are just trying to tell him, what are you doing? But then on the other side, you got Wolverine, who, even though he has been on the same X-Men team with him for a long time, immediately goes for the kill. I think it does a good job of showing what Magneto's capable of, because he counters pretty much everything. Gambit throws cards, he counters it. The Blackbird comes in, he literally just stops it. And he basically counters pretty much everything until Psylocke finally gets one hit in. And then Wolverine gets a hit in, and, he starts getting pushed back. The really standout part about this is when he gets knocked into the skull and bones that are floating, the people he killed in the sub. And as the X-Men are charging into him, you get a lot of really good monologue of basically telling you the past while you're looking at what's happening in the present and trying to give you as much content as you can get. Well, of course, one team ain't stopping Magneto, so he finally gets tired of fighting the X-Men, and he's like, I'm just leaving. He's like, if I stay, Wolverine's gonna kill me, or I'm gonna kill Wolverine. That's basically how their relationship is in the future. Like, they're gonna fight till the end. As he's leaving, Rogue, of course, which is probably the closest X-Men to him from the previous runs, tries to talk more sense into him. And as they're going, she gets hit by a missile because, the U.S. governments are renowned for their diplomacy and hitting the wrong person. She literally, as she gets hit, Magneto detonates a nuke. Mm-hmm. So even though he's looking for a deterrent, he's already used one off of just a flicker of a second. So it just shows you how ready he was to go back to those ways. After that, you kind of get to the next part where he's back at his asteroid, he's healing, and then you get to see the other part of this story that's actually quite interesting, where not everyone that came to his asteroid is there for good reasons. So you get a character named Cortez. You get a character named Cortez who is kind of, I guess you could call the mastermind of trying to get Magneto back to his ways, even though he's kind of an idiot. Like, it's the one part where Cortez he was always meant to be like an antagonist of everybody, like 100%. Both sides.
I hate that character.
But which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but everything he does backfires on him, like everything in comics. Yeah. But, so you get to that, and his power, basically, he describes to Magneto that he can heal him, which isn't true in any sense. He can enhance, but most of his powers are, in the long run, not a good thing. So after that, we kind of go through, it turns out Rogue got hit over Genosha, so we even get Genosha in this. This isn't the Genosha that a lot of people are used to, because Genosha had already been kind of cooed by the X-Men before, so this is a new type of government where it's not as hostile to mutants as they used to be. This is where the mutants that actually showed up at Magneto's doorsteps kind of become in the 90s, what they called the Acolytes, which was basically his Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. Mostly forgettable characters in that, but they serve their purpose as being kind of like round one of the X-Men fights. So they go to pick up Rogue, and of course the second fight ensues. Once the rest of the X-Men get there, it's actually a pretty fun fight. It starts off with most of the X-Men taking out at least one of the Acolytes pretty quick. As soon as Magneto lands, it's a whole different story. I mean, so he lands, and that's the end of the first issue of the three. After that, you get a lot of dialogue. Like I said, once again, these are still characters that, and you'll see this through the early 90s run. There's a lot of dialogue whenever Magneto's concerned, because they're always trying to convince him not to do what he does.
Right.
And even he has good points whenever he's talking. He's not completely wrong whenever he's talking about something like that, because he usually ends up being right to a certain extent. But it's just more of his methods have always been far, far more severe than they needed to be. So the second fight, once again, it's X-Men versus Magneto again. It's another good fight, but this time you get to see some of the humans go through. Cortez uses his power on Psylocke, which,
yeah.
well, it does work. Whenever he uses that, it's kind of iffy. It works, but if the person withstands it, you made a mistake. So there was another comic later on where he used it on Bishop, and Bishop couldn't handle it because of the way his power was. So he drops Psylocke, and the X-Men are fighting, and they start to pretty much get wiped out by Magneto. Like, it's not a contest. He is literally just wrapping them up and dropping them down. you got to remember too, this is also a much stronger Magneto that has ever been in the comics. They amped him up extremely on this. He basically holds his asteroid in orbit by himself without effort.
And then he's got Cortez there too, so I mean it's even more than even than they.
Oh, that's nothing. Wait till Exodus gets there. This is something the X-Men really wasn't used to. This is Magneto on Apocalypse level scale. So the only reason that they had a chance against him and they were able to wound him is once again Cortez is an idiot and amps up Psylocke to the point where she can drop Magneto with the Psy Blade. So after that, of course, one of the mutant powers of the Acolyte, which is one of the weirdest ones ever, where he can change the material things are made out of, basically freezes all the X-Men and plot stuff. So once that gets done, we get to the end, and now we have, in 3 comics, we have the third part of the story aspect, which is the Moira Mataga thing. So at this point, Magneto has discovered some evidence that Moira Mataga had gone through and edited his DNA, or did something to him, because one of the things in the older comics was, for a few months, Magneto was an infant. He was de-aged and then re-aged back up so that he could be a younger man in the comics again. But during that time, he was with Moira on her island. This is where I think Magneto kind of gets very far extreme, because he starts threatening friends for really no reason. I mean, he throws Xavier out into space if Moira doesn't tell him what he wants to know. I mean, you're already seeing Magneto kind of go from, we're friends, I don't want to fight these people, to, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get this done. And it didn't take very long, but... So you get all that, and you kind of find out what she did, and what she did was she saw some irregularities with his powers, so, in his DNA. So she thought if she could get rid of that, she could kind of give him a normal life. She thought the reason why he became what he became was because his powers distorted his mind. But we'll get back to that, because that's also a loose plot thread for the third comic. So you get to the end of that comic, and basically the end of the comic is just Magneto torturing her by encasing her in metal over and over and over again, which kind of uncharacteristic for Magneto. This is the first time you really see him do any type of intentional physical harm to somebody over and over.
Well, and I like in there, and we had kind of discussed too, where, I mean, he's just going on about this rant, and they've got, that dialogue is very, very strong.
Yeah.
And he's even sitting in here, and I've got it popped up where it says, I've heard of some of these rationalities before as a boy in Auschwitz death camps from Dr. Joseph Mengele. And for any listeners that don't know who that is, I wouldn't ever say recommend researching these kind of things of the Nazi Party, but Mengele was definitely one of the sickest quote unquote scientists they've had. So that is a very strong statement to put into a comic like that. He was not a nice person whatsoever.
Well, that was always, Magneto always worked because of that. But this comic gave him the rest of his personality. Mm-hmm. This is the best version of Magneto. You can say what you say about 90s comics, but 90s did create the best version of Magneto. And to me, it's still the pinnacle of that character as a villain. And he's been a hero for quite a while. Well, kind of. He's been an X-Men for quite a while. But so after that, we pick up with the Gold Team in the Danger Room, trying to figure out how they can beat Magneto, the Acolytes, and their former X-Men. Because it turns out at the end of the second comic, Magneto forces Moira to do the same thing that she did to him, to all the Blue X-Men. So it's kind of a mind control story. So they're just going through stuff, trying to find a plan. Nothing really happens. They have no plan, but they're out of time. You get to the third comic, and this is kind of where things get weird, but also where it gets cool, because you rarely get to see 2 X-Men teams just go at it. The really weird part is Storm is flying basically in space, and that's always weird to see when she does that. So the X-Men have a plan to go back to Asteroid M. Pretty much simple plan, go and stealth ship, use powers to get there instead of propulsion. The other thing is you get back to, once again, the kind of the strong dialogue that you were talking about was Moira and Magneto once again having conversation again, and talking about Xavier and how he doesn't want Xavier mind controlled, he wants him broken. So once again, this is far beyond what you really ever saw with Magneto on how vicious he would be. I mean, she's still encased in metal too. So you also see the first signs of Cortez's influence of his powers waning on Magneto to an extreme extent. And I think it's actually pretty cool because Moore actually still tries to help him even though he's torturing her during that time. The other thing that you get at the very beginning of this is you get a lot of the X-Men and the Acolytes together, just basically hanging out, swimming, stuff like that. And you get to see signs that the mind control isn't exactly what it should be, but you don't know why it's failing yet. You just see it failing in random situations, or it looks like it's failing. So you get to the fight, and basically the X-Men just use Iceman and Colossus to break into the asteroid. Nothing special there. Basically, but everyone knew they were coming. Cyclops kisses Jean, blasts her immediately. Basically, the X-Men are basically fighting on their back toes. I mean, you do have Banshee on the team and Forge, so it's a little bit extended of a team, but they're outnumbered at least 2-1. The only thing that gives them a bit of respite is brainwashed Psylocke hits Iceman with her abilities, and that wasn't smart because he's another one who can't control his abilities that well, so that creates a bunch of chaos. And the fight continues. Once again, it's the third fight with the same people. This one's a lot shorter, though. You still see the classic stuff with Magneto. You see the Force Bubble. You see him and Xavier going at it. But the fight's pretty much ended rather quickly when Wolverine actually gets a back shot on him. Wolverine wounds him enough to basically put an end to the fight. And then humans step in, blast the asteroid, as, once again, they do. And then it's mostly conversation at that point. It's both sides arguing their point again. It's a debate on a dying asteroid. Basically, it sets this up for the Magneto we'll see for the next 4 years, probably. So the whole mind control thing, though, gets absolved, and you find out that even though she did modify with his DNA, it didn't affect his personality. Magneto is who Magneto is. Basically, whatever she did, whenever a mutant power is activated, it reverts it back to it was, which is actually kind of cool because it's actually somewhat how later they cure the legacy virus. Mm-hmm. By mutant activation resets. So you do get to the point where Magneto he was so mad he wouldn't listen to anybody. No, there's no reason at this point. There's just his way again. And that's pretty much how the comic stops. I think this is one of the easier ones to kind of get into. There's still better entry points to X-Men, but this one's a nice short one with clean art, and almost every character is known. The art is very good. I'd probably give the art an 8 because I'm a Jim Lee fan. If you don't know Jim Lee, it might be a 7. Story-wise, I think the story is actually pretty good. There's a little bit too much woven in with the mind control, the multiple teams, Cortez's power eroding Magneto. There's a bit much, so I would say story 2 does suffer a bit on that, and I would probably say story is a 7. But I'd say readability on this it's an 8. It's easy to get into. It's like I said, the most well-known story, the most well-known team, and pretty much it did set the stage, and I think it was Claremont's last credit. Well, this was Claremont's last credit. These were the last 3 comics he did. But this was also the start to the Jim Lee comics, which were better than most people say that they were. I think these comics were directly tied to X-Men being good in the 90s longer than a lot of other series were. Because by about 93, a lot of comics were starting to wane in their popularity, and a lot of stories were starting to rehash and go under it. Go extreme to the whole, 90s, 2000 extreme stuff. Because of this, we got some really good stories. I think this and Claremont's run kept X-Men going well into the 90s, well into Age of Apocalypse for a while there until it too succumbed to the Marvel greed of its corporation. I do have to say it is probably one of my favorite quick X-Men runs. I am a fan of X-Men, of the new X-Men reboot. Probably for at least the first 2 to 3 years. I think that they're quite well done. But, yeah, that'd be it for me.
I agree with a lot of what you said, too, the artwork for me with Chagin is, I don't know if I was looking at it like, oh, it's Jim Lee, and just saying it's going to be amazing, so I made it amazing. But like, what I do like about the way Jim Lee does things is there is no detail that doesn't matter. Like, now sometimes that's okay, you just spent a whole lot of time putting a lot of details where it didn't need to be, but like his artwork is very telling of the story. And again, like you said, when I think comic books and I think X-Men, this is the way they're supposed to look. Even when we did the last one, where it's very cut and dry, blocky, whatever, this is just better. And it's Claremont. I mean, I don't think I have read a bad Claremont yet, which Nick, I know, will disagree with me on, but I will say that across the board, same. Art is an 8, story is a 7. I would give readability. Yeah, I'll give readability an 8 as well, just because I think X-Men's biggest flaw is that they throw people into it, and you don't know if that person's important or not. Like you said, the acolytes are kind of just thrown in there. I still don't know who they are.
Yeah, and the group changes throughout 2 years. I mean, it's a rotating door. It's Magneto's henchmen. It's a way to use them without using the old characters and using the old characters for other things. I mean, there's rarely an acolyte that's important. I mean, Cortez has a few comics that he's important later. Later, when Exodus becomes the leader of them, he's rather important, but for different reasons that I don't want to spoil.
Yeah.
But if you look at the base group, the only time that they're really important is when an acolyte comes from somebody the X-Men knew before, which does happen, where you'll get a revived character. Even small spoilers, but Colossus becomes an acolyte at one point. But other than that, they are kind of throwaway battle characters. But that's something Jim Lee's known for, is he needs enough characters for the fights to kind of go on. So the best Jim Lee comics are the ones he has a lot of characters to work with, because he likes to tell a lot of his stories while the action is going.
Right.
And you need a lot of characters to keep that going. Well,
and again, with the where Magneto's going off on Moira, and I'm looking at it, and even in the background you have the 2 acolytes there. So again, his art is very much like, oh, there's something happened, but these 2 are in the background for no reason. So that's interesting to me. But like, I will also say, one of the great things about X-Men is you'll have the X-Men team fighting whoever they're fighting, right? So in this case, Magneto and his acolytes on the mutants. But then I think a lot of people also forget that there's always that third antagonist in their book. And that is usually S.H.I.E.L.D. or the government or humans, quote unquote. And I think this did a really good job about kind of bringing that in, like reminding you that these 2 might be fighting each other, but there's always this outside source that really does not like them. And watching Magneto's trip down insanity in this was kind of awesome for me, because he does just start off like saying, I don't have a cause anymore. I don't know what you guys are here. Like, I'm not doing this. But as soon as he kills it, he's like, no, we're done. And then,
well, it's like he's got a heart, but it's easy to break again. Any tragedy he sees sets him off. It's very much a glass shield that he has around his emotions. And I think that's why he's always been a strong character. But even with all that going and his rage and everything, the amount of forethought and planning that Magneto always has. I mean, again, how long has it been since that nuke's sitting there and he just, all right, I have a nuclear ship just in case I ever need it. I mean, that's very scary to me as Magneto, and that's why he's the main villain of, arguably he's the main villain of the X-Men, but Mr. Wilson, though, is impatiently waiting for us. What are your thoughts on the best comic ever written?
So, I have a lot of very vivid memories of my life when this comic book came out. And I think Brian did a really great job of summarizing it. And, there's a lot a lot of fluff in there that you didn't focus on, and you hit on all the really important points. So I'll talk a little bit about the comic itself and how that affected me. And I just remember that when this comic book came out, everybody knew that it had sold 2 million copies and that it was heralding a new age of comics. And it was before all the negativity, right? Like when this comic book actually came out, well, that's when people were getting excited. That's when people were talking about all the speculator BS and thinking that this was going to be a $5,000 comic book in 20 years and they were going to send their kids off to college by selling it. But that was before the artist, along with 5 other guys, jumped ship to do something else. And then that is really what caused the unfortunate boom and bust of the 90s. But there are so many images in all 3 of them, but in the first one especially, that are iconic as a result of the success of this comic. And I'm talking about the fastball specials. I'm talking about when Archangel throws Colossus, like that image when Archangel throws Colossus. I think that I've seen it on, like, I don't know, at least 4 or 5 different X-Men variant covers since, just because it's so reused and reiterated. But I remember reading this as a young person, and I read a lot of Chris Claremont as a young person. And as a result of that, I had an English teacher who got very upset with me because she told me that I used way too many words and way more than I needed to. And I explained to her, like, well, but look at this. And I used this as an example. And she was like, this is not good. is what she was essentially what I remember it. There's more to the story than that. But the point is that you said that I would disagree with you. I don't dislike Chris Claremont at all. I like Chris Claremont a lot. And I think this is a good comic book. The thing is about it, though, is Chris Claremont does write with a great deal of verbose dialogue and a lot less subtlety than the person who wrote the comic that you chose. For example, Ryan, that we're going to talk about, which is just an exemplary example of subtlety and character development. I love the one that you picked. And the thing about that is, like, reading this still, I agree with everything positive that Brian said. It's like an iconic book. It sets the stage for a new era of both Magneto and the X-Men, the blue and gold teams. But honestly, I read it. I was like, cool. Thank you for the reminder of the reintroduction. And I wanted to get on to the next part. Like, I wanted to read about Omega Red. I knew that John Byrne was going to take over and all that kind of stuff. Like, this still feels now, it feels like Chris Claremont's swan song to me. Whereas a child, it felt like a moving experience every time I opened it. I mean, I remember going to Toys R Us, rest in peace, Toys R Us. But I remember going to Toys R Us, and when this comic came out, you could go buy this, like, collector's edition thing that was plastic, and there were so many of these comics that had been printed that were out there that people like Toys R Us were selling them in, like, packs. That's how many of these there were. And somehow people still thought it was going to be worth $1 million or whatever. But it was everywhere. I had T-shirts with this cover on it. I mean, it was everywhere. And, Jim Lee had only been drawing X-Men in the Uncanny for a little while before this. And yeah, I think the only thing I would maybe disagree a little bit on is you said if you're not a Jim Lee person, this would be a 7. I still think it's awesome. I think it's exemplary art. He's not my favorite guy because he is like what you said. This is what comic books are supposed to be. So I kind of like when the artists have their own spin a little bit more than him. But there are also so many artists, that just still to this day are their thing is to imitate Jim Lee. And that's why even now his style has changed. He's changed his style. He's evolved it. He doesn't really draw this way anymore currently. Anyway, I think you really summed it up. There were just a couple of things I wanted to point out. Fabian Cortez is such a lame character that he never even got an action figure. And I mean, when you get down to it, Gideon got an action figure. The guy with 4 arms that nobody remembers the name of, that guy had an action figure. Fabian Cortez, no action figure. Yeah, very lame
Tusk
character.
has an action figure.
There you go. That one, and the guy that like had an arm that morphed into a weird fleshy gun thing that I can't remember his name now either.
Oh, yeah.
We'll look it up. Random. Go. Well done, sir. Give that man an inspiration.
I
His
would say
character
that
gets
was
an inspiration.
random.
Oh, hey, there are fathers in the room. We have jokes. So yeah, it's. I also wanted to point out, just because you mentioned it, there's one of the acolytes. His name is Chrome, and in the comic, he like just waves his hand and he's like, "I'm sorry, I was late, Magneto. I would have saved you." And then he turns a bunch of the X-Men into like stuck in a transitory state, like a statue. And so I looked him up because I was like, wow, that's a heinous ability. Why doesn't he just rule the world? And it's apparently he is, even though he's called Chrome, which seems to be connected to what he turned them into, he can transmit or whatever it's called, reconstitute matter in anything else. So I guess he's like technically Omega level guy, but he wasn't in that many comic books as most of the acolytes weren't. I did also want to say what you said about a little bit of the loose plot stuff with the mutant powers being what got rid of the brainwashing. It did seem a little like, well, like there could have been a little bit more. Like it should take a great deal to convince those people to do what they did and fight against each other so easily, and it didn't. It was a little surprising. Like I felt like there could have been a little bit more there, and then there could also have been a little bit more than got them out of it. But whatever. The faster they get out of it, the faster we get to X-Men 4, we get to see Omega Red, and that's better anyway. So, I also read just for anybody who cares, I read the recolored edition, which is Mutant Genesis 2.0, and it's just an edition that they recolored way later, and it's all the same art, but it's absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, I've seen the cover of that one, but I haven't read it. It's modern colorized, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Digitally, yes, if that's what you mean. And I did want to point out that there are pinups at the end of these comics, and they're awesome. I will tell you, I was like 8 or 9 years old, and I was much more interested in the Jim Lee pinups of the X-Men poolside with Psylocke and Jean Grey and Rogue and everybody than I was with the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue. That's all I'm saying. That's how good he was.
So, funny thing about that is me and my dad were in a comic book store, which he took me every once in a while. I got most of my comics from an ice cream shop before, which I got to see I used to have an old style ice cream area. Every once in a while, about every couple months, we go to the neighboring city and go to a comic book shop. My dad thought it was funny because I was about 13 or 14, and I just kept staring at them. But the Marvel swimsuit editions, have you ever seen them? So he bought them for me just to see my face of me walking up and having to buy those. But yeah, so I had those for the longest time. I don't have them anymore. I don't know when I threw them out. But I can tell you, as a young teenager, I definitely looked through them quite often.
There were a lot of companies that kind of went with that weird trend for a little while there. In the age of the artist. So I'll just give you my numbers so we can keep going, because I mean it's an iconic book. It's an awesome book. It was great to read it again. Art. I mean, I'm gonna give the art a 10. I mean, if I'm gonna give Batman Last Night on Earth a 10, I think I have to give this Jim Lee a 10. If it was his first X-Men comic, which this is not, then I'd maybe be a little bit lower. But I feel like this is when he just got to one of his peaks in this style. So I'm gonna give that a 10. The story, I'm going to say an 8.5. I'm going to say the readability is a 7, and the reason is I think that some of it, yes, they summarize what has happened in the past, but they just do it in such a way that lambasts the reader, especially the part about explaining how he became a baby and then he got big again and like all that stuff. It's not super easy. The only reason that this is more readable than a lot of other stuff is because you just open it up and your eyes melt in wonder, because it's like a Michael Mann or a Michael... the guy that did The Rock and Transformer, Michael Bay. This is a great comic for spectacle because the art is just amazing. That makes it almost easier to read, despite Chris Claremont's word count. So that's my numbers.
By the way, the final sale on this, I looked it up, was $8.1 million. The next comic below that is $1.07 million, which is Star Wars #1. So I think it's fair to say that this will always be probably the #1 selling comic of all time. But once again, the reason for that, and like I said, there's some stuff that you can see in this comic that it was awesome back in the day, but you kind of blame it for later. You're like, variant covers. You're the one to blame why I have 15 different variant covers for this comic. You do see some of the modern stuff and the more greediness from Marvel that you saw in the 90s. This was kind of the start of it, so it is it's kind of like The Death of Superman, where it's a bit infamous, not for the content of it, but what it ended up doing to the industry.
Mm-hmm. Or the breaking of Batman's back.
Oh, yeah. That's the only Batman comic I have, by the way.
So just to clarify, this comic had 4 covers, and it had a fold-out cover, which was like it was the one that was the collector's edition. So that 8.1 number, everybody kind of forgets. That's how many were ordered from the printer, right? That's not how many people bought. And I'm not contradicting you. I'm just saying, like, it will not be a record that's broken. I agree, like, ever. But it's a testament to that really was the beginning of people buying comics because they think it's going to be something that it turned out not to be. Because that's why you could get the gatefold edition and all 4 covers at Toys R Us in this nice thing that had it sealed mint looking for like $10 at one point. Because these comics were everywhere. Like, it was not a hard comic to get.
No.
At all.
Now, I do remember there was a doctor I used to know when I was a kid. And his whole retirement plan was he had warehouses of comics.
Yeah.
So he's probably still working.
He's doing better lately. Things have been changing a whole lot in the last couple of years, but I guess it depends on what he bought back then.
Well, it's funny that we kind of have that conversation because my dad was the same way. Like, not a collector, not a nerd whatsoever. But when he saw me starting to get into it and bought me a few of the first comics, he had brought me in the wrap, in the board, sealed, and not graded, which real comic book readers know that, that's an actual something that might be worth something someday. But he brings me these comics and he's like, now you want to keep these sealed because they could be worth something someday. And I think I got you some ones that the guy at the store said, are really going to be collectors. And I laugh now because every comic you get is bagged and board. And you're like, yeah, you leave this sealed so it's mint condition, blah, blah, blah. You're like, what? No, you read comics.
That was still the practice back in the day. I mean, you always at least bagged and bordered them. I mean, you did have, like, I was always a reader. I kept my comics in good condition, but there wasn't a comic I never opened. Even the one that I showed you guys that had the 24 karat gold, I took that out of the case at least once. I had to look at it. To me, the collecting part is secondhand. There's comics that I don't open anymore, like I have Wolverine 1 through 125. I won't be opening Wolverine 1 through 10 ever again. Or I have the entire Dark Phoenix saga. I won't be opening those comics again. But I at least read the comics themselves at least once. But there's no way I'm going to buy a comic and not read it. This is not going to be a thing. You also remember back in our day, there weren't graphic novels as readily as it is now. They were very rare. Yep. I think it took 15 years for the Dark Phoenix classic novel to come out. Back when we were kids, if you wanted to read Dark Phoenix, you had to open those comics.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Comixology definitely spoils us because we're like, okay, I can read every comic. And if you really grab one that you want, you then go to the internet and buy it for a collector's piece.
Yeah.
But moving on, my pick of the week, it's Punisher #1 by Rucka. And it was definitely the easiest comic I've ever read.
Quick, you should probably put the year in, especially if it's a Punisher. So this one was, 2011?
Yes.
2011.
This is a more common thing, especially in modern comics, where every couple years you get a new #1. So it's easier just to say the title with the years that it ran.
Noted. I will say the artwork definitely stood out for me, and I've seen Punisher as a side character before, and I've never read any of his main lines, so it was definitely a new experience for me. The artwork, very realistic looking. It was kind of random when it started up, where it was like, okay, what's this wedding and these pictures and this, that, the other, but once you've read through the comic and you kind of go back to it again, it makes a lot more sense. Like, it's very telling of, like, where there are no words in this and you actually have to pay attention to each scene. And it goes from this wedding happy to all of a sudden there's a gang members that show up and start shooting. And it gets very bloody very quickly, which I think is a Punisher. That's what he's known for.
Staple.
Yeah, staple is blood and gore. Visually, you don't see the gore necessarily all the time, but you know it's there. And I like that about this artist. You see the story, the tears. I think when they pan over a few in, and it's just, you see the massacre of the whole wedding and everybody's just laying on the ground. It's dark shadowed on the outside. The background's very blurred out. Once you actually get into the story, there is no introduction for Frank Castle. So it is assuming you know who he is and all this, but I'm kind of glad that they didn't go full backstory, because how many comics do you just like, oh, we're rebooting a movie. Let's see Batman get his parents shot again. And let's see Superman, getting raised and this, that, the other. And every time they do a reboot, as fans, you know what it is. So I think that's why we throw out all the restarts, and we've kind of talked about so far, is you're like, oh, it's just retelling his backstory again. Nothing special here. This didn't do that, and I really enjoyed that. But then eventually you see Punisher fighting the Vulture, and we kind of talked about how Spider-Man and Daredevil's villains cross over into these different story arcs of comics, and you're like, oh yeah, they're all in the same city. And that was interesting to me. But then you see a random board meeting of these supervillains. They're just talking, and you're like, who are these people? Why are they important to the story? And then you just see, we can continue to stay in this city and deal with the Punisher. Ooh, big deal. Or you guys can go back to getting your butts kicked by the Avengers. And you kind of realize, that is what Punisher is. When these villains are, trying to run and hide, he is the hunt down and deal with the nitty-gritty of life. And so I really enjoyed it. I'm going to go 6 for story, because it's not there even though it is. I thought that what was there is really good, but I came to read a comic. So to me, that it kind of lacked on actual story. Art, I'm going to put a 9, and passability, I'll probably go 7. But Mr. Wilson, you had your thoughts, sir.
Okay. I think I may have read this many years ago in Comixology, but I'm not sure. But I really liked it. And yes, all kidding aside, go ahead and flip to page 11 of the first issue. And if you look at page 11 of the first issue, you're going to look at the third panel. Tell me who's in that panel.
It's Morgan Freeman.
Yeah.
Morgan Freeman. Yep. That's a Morgan Freeman tracing. Literally. That's a common art thing artists started doing in the aughts. And I think it looks cool. But it's interesting because if you've seen the movie 7, multiple of these parts are actually in the movie 7. There's another page where the cop is putting on a glove to look at the dead bodies. It's just it's interesting because it is exactly those two. It's Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman from 7. But that small detail aside, I really thought this was excellent. And Greg Rucka has done some Wolverine stuff before, as well as some other things. I felt that this story, yes, it did not have a great deal of words, but especially in the second and third issues, they tell a lot. They tell a great deal of story. This is not a comic book that just because it was read quickly is not chock full of meat, in my opinion.
Yeah,
and that's because you'll notice the Punisher does not even speak for most of all 3 of these issues that we read, and everything is not really about the Punisher. It's about how the people in the Punisher's environment are affected by being in the Punisher's environment
100%.
For the most part. And that is really kind of cool because you're not really reading a comic book about the Punisher. You're reading a comic book about this detective, this guy that got promoted because he saved some people's lives. And then he gets to work with Morgan Freeman. And so then it's about how, as a result of something good that he does, him and the Punisher connect, And then he starts to have like get text messages from the Punisher and like they work together silently kind of thing. But it's all very subtle. But as it goes on, the character development and the depth of story is incredible because there are two characters in particular. One of them is the woman that survives the massacre. She's the only person that survives. And on multiple occasions, doctors or the cops come to interview her and they call her Mrs. Cole. And she says, no, it's Alvarez. I took my husband's name. Mm-hmm. And then she says that again later. And then there's a panel with no dialogue that shows the doctor is putting her chart back in its slot, and it says R. Cole on it. And so I'm sorry, but that panel and that dialogue says to me volumes more than 15 paragraphs of Magneto talking about Auschwitz and how he was sinking a submarine.
Right.
It just does. It's more entertaining to me. I like that a lot more. That requires thought and observation. And it means that when Greg Rucka wrote this, you understand when the comic book artist writes that, he's not just like, hey, artist, come up with a way to convey this message. And then the artist goes and is like, oh, I'll put the chart in there and that'll do that. No, the writer tells the artist, like, this is what you're going to paint. And that's part of his process. So just because the characters aren't talking, so the one character, the woman that survives, you just see her start to realize what has happened to her, and you see like it's some interesting origin story. And what they do is, as she's in the hospital bed, starting to remember everything that happened and go nuts, it juxtaposes it with Frank's fight with, I think, the Vulture at the time, and it's just really interesting because it's like, why is this happening to Frank and her at the same time? Why is this important? And then in addition to that, you have this reporter. And so this reporter, all she does, she's introduced by coming in there and talking to Morgan and Brad and just asking questions about a crime scene. And apparently she is, she's an anchor now or something. And she's mainly on the video, on the news. And she's talking to them and they're like, you're better at this. Why are you even out here though? Your boss wants you to be on the screen, on the camera. And she's like, no, this is where I want to be. And then Morgan Freeman says to her, he's like, if you want your boss to take you off the camera and get you back on the street doing what you're good at, you need to go get a haircut because you're too cute and too pretty the way you look. And then he'll take you off the camera. And so she goes and gets a haircut. And this is awesome. This is freaking awesome. This character gets half of her haircut and then she gets a text with a lead for a story. So she leaves with like a half shaved head mohawk deal because it's more important to her.
Right.
And I'm just like, well, I'll take that all day versus like have somebody having to just slam you in the face with every detail or
right.
Instead of having a text box there that says, this reporter 20 years, here's a big long paragraph, when that's what a comic book can do that other things can't do. Whereas when you just describe everything, then it's like, okay, well, this is just a novel with pictures.
I knew you would be able to convey what I was saying. I couldn't get that out. I was like,
I thought you did great.
That's why I think I like comics more too, is because the art portrays 90% of the message of the story. Whereas like if you're just reading, like if these were, can you imagine these stories being novels? You'd go insane because, but
right.
Well, it fixes the problem that novels have too, that if you're not insanely detailed in your novels, different people get extremely different things out of the books almost.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can get two completely different opinions of an area in a novel unless you do like The Wheel of Time does, where he'll explain a tree for 2.5 pages. So, like I said, there's mediums that do a lot of things better, and one thing that comic definitely do better is they're the first step of giving you a lot of details outside of telling you every detail. So, like he was saying, you get a lot, especially in modern comics now. This wasn't the way around in the 80s or even early 90s, but yeah, modern comics, a good modern comic will give you a lot of the stuff not in the wording of it. It's a lot about the angles that are being drawn, what's in them, and you can get a lot of details that you'll miss the first time on some of these comics too. But
well, not to interrupt Nick and all what he was going through, but I will go back and upgrade my my story from a 6 to an 8 because like, again, for me, if I was just sitting there reading dialogue, I would very easily, with my attention issues, like, jump in and out, probably miss some details. Where when here, I probably miss some details of the artwork, but like I will go back and it's a lot easier for me to then pick something up and go, oh, I see how this relates to, down the road or this, that, the other. Whereas if I'm trying to reread it, you're like, I'm missing this part of the storyline here. But no, you look at the art frame and you're like, nope, I know what, he's trying to convey. So yes, this did a very, very good job of that. But carry on, sir.
I mean, that's the gist of it. I think that we should probably throw out the vulture in the room because it's definitely a different vulture than I remember. This is not the Michael Keaton version of the vulture.
No, there was a point in time where Marvel got away from the technology side of thing and started making more characters have their actual powers, and it wasn't a popular vulture.
Well, even your later on animated show vulture was like a withered old man that's
the classic vulture.
Yeah.
That's typically what he usually was. So I don't know. The thing is, I didn't care. It looked different to me than the vulture I knew, but I've never loved the vulture. So honestly, I thought this vulture was a little cooler because he was like, with like big claws and everything. But it was kind of like, all right, so all these wealthy mobsters get together and they really need somebody who's definitely going to be able to take out the Punisher. Let's go hire the vulture.
Said no one ever.
Like, really? He can't even have he can't even have a conversation. Because he's just like, Punisher or something weird that is in there.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's fine. That's probably the only thing that I was kind of like, he looked cool, but I don't know. I didn't need the vulture. Didn't need the vulture. I could have been.
They needed a super villain that they could throw to him to be like, "Hey, Punisher kills villains too." Here,
right?
Like, this vulture to me would be like one of them where if they kind of mixed in the mutagen aspect of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, like, yeah, this would be what that is. It's like that. It drove him insane. He became very animalistic. So, like, yeah, it's not Vulture, but it is.
But it's a good Vulture for the Punisher because it's more violent. This Vulture would be terrible in a Spider-Man comic.
Because he'd be sitting there trying to eat Spider-Man.
Well, not only that, but in the Spider-Man comic, you're not going to get the blood. You might get a little bit of blood, but, like, the talons are completely useless in the Spider-Man comic because they're not going to show the graphic detail.
Now, do you think that he might have drawn Vulture this way and, like, wrote him in this way because it's Punisher?
No, it's not meant for kids. Version of Vulture.
Oh, well, I was trying to like save it a little bit. No. Like, Punisher's not a kid's comic. I would never recommend Punisher to my kids ever. Like, maybe when they're older, but
it's like top 3 comics you don't recommend for children. Punisher,
anime, the X-Men anime,
I say you don't recommend that to anybody.
All right. I did want to point out one more thing, and then I'll give you my ratings. I just think it's interesting. He liberates a house of ill repute where there are ladies of the night. I know we're a PG-13 podcast. And when he's there, after he kills all the bad guys that were like, opposing him, he comes up across this other woman that's not with the employees of this house of ill repute. And she's like, it wasn't me. I wasn't doing anything. I was just giving the girls the drugs to keep them that way so they do what they were supposed to do. And then she runs away, and Frank Castle pops this woman in the back of like kills her from behind.
Nice.
Straight up. And it's like, I thought that was really interesting because then the following panels, you see the prostitutes standing behind him, like looking over his shoulder, and one of them's like smiling, and the other one, like, they're bright-eyed, and it's like you can see it's like a moment where they're really trying to like remind everybody why anti-heroes are loved, kind of, right? I guess it's kind of like, yeah, glad that he shot that woman in the back. That's horrible, Well,
but I was going to mention too, like, I think that's one of my biggest loves about Punisher. Is you see this gruff guy running around and he's shooting everybody, this, that, the other. But when they stop we'll call them the action sequences in half of his stories, and like in this one, he's in the house in the middle of I think it's the woods in a snowstorm with that kid. And you see him soften up so quickly when he's bandaging himself, and like you see we'll call it a human side to him. And you're like you would never see that side anywhere if he's dealing with one of the bad guys. And I always love that switch in. Again, the anti-heroes are why people love them. Is like, here's Punisher running around and he kills a kid, and then I would imagine him like pulling out a sucker and handing it to a kid walking down the street that happened to see him, shoot somebody. And
right.
that was really cool to me. Like, I don't know if that kid is important or why he was in the story, besides to show Punisher's human side.
Right.
So that made him infinitely more important.
Well, the Punisher is a dad, sadly.
Was.
Was.
Yeah, was. So, sometimes that's a trope with the Punisher, you know what I mean? Like, you'll be reminded of that.
Yeah, but that's a good anti-hero, though. A good anti-hero still has his humanity. He just doesn't show it on a daily basis.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that always grounds him, too, because if you imagine if Punisher ever did really lose it, he would be a psychopath. Running around and just blindly killing.
And he has been written that way, where he's more of a psychopath, but yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't like those stories. Like, they don't appeal. But your ratings, sir?
Yeah, I'm going to say 7 for the art, because I don't know, like, why it's necessary to imitate that, but it's fine. And I think the art direction was really good. I think the art direction redeems some of it. And obviously the person can draw. I just think that they don't need to draw actors in a Hollywood movie for any purpose here. And I would say the story is a 9, and honestly, I would give the readability a 9, because I think that if you know nothing about the Punisher, you can read this, and it's pretty good. But I will note that at the beginning of issue 4, they have this whole introducing the Punisher, reminding everybody he was in the Marines, reminding everybody about what happened to his family thing. Because I clicked on to issue 4, and I think they kind of got to that point, and they were like, let's remind anybody like where Frank came from.
Right.
Even though everything before this. So, I don't know. Thought it was a pretty awesome pick. Good job, man.
And Mr. Huber, your thoughts real quick?
Well, the first thing I'd like to point out is that this is definitely it definitely is a different Punisher one, because he's treated more of like a natural disaster than a person. Even when he was walking through, like you said, the gentleman's club or whatever that was, the women were like, oh God, he's here. And they literally just watched him walk through the halls like, him, God. But he's literally, at this point, he's such a known thing that people are like, well, we're not going to get rid of him. We just let him do it. Like the one guy that they caught. They're like, oh, he left you alive? Well, there's only 2 reasons he did that, so get out of my club.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, the whole vulture thing, that is kind of a normal trope. Where usually, almost in every Punisher run, a supervillain is hired to try to kill him. And there's actually, it's done multiple times in this one, especially towards the later. This is written around the Dark Avenger time, so that also takes place with some side stories with that going down it. But, yeah, like you said, the only real problem I had with this was when you hit issue 4, you kind of hit a wall. Like, you are running through these comics, like, extremely fast, extremely easy, and then you hit origin story. And you kind of just faceplant. It's just such an abrupt slowdown of info dump that it kind of was off-putting to me. The only other thing that I saw that I was kind of... You may not be able to appreciate the art is little dialogue they have, because unless you're intentionally doing it, you're not on the panels long enough.
Mm-hmm.
So they could have put a little bit more in there to slow you down a little bit.
Sure.
Because I do think there's a lot of detail in there that could be missed if, say, you're trying to catch up on comics, you're 30 comics behind, and you go, oh, thank God, this one doesn't have much.
Right.
Other than that, I think the art was pretty well done. It's extremely dark. I like this style of Punisher. It's not the jump shoot Punisher. It's Punisher with a skull t-shirt. It's definitely more humanized. It's back down to earth. Kind of wish we heard a little bit more from Frank Castle, because it did kind of play more into like a Spectre or a Ghost Rider comic than a Daredevil comic, because it's just like, I'm here, you're dead, I'm leaving.
Yeah.
But other than that, I mean, it does suit that character, so it's just a bit weird, because usually Castle is a bit more vocal, a bit more characters. I do agree with you that the side characters actually have really good story to it. I did like the girls the survivor's story quite a bit. The journalist story was quite fun to see, but it was kind of fun just seeing how the world reacts to Frank Castle nowadays. Now that it's more of an everyday thing that Frank Castle is just here. I would say art-wise, I'm probably about a 7. I would say story, probably say 8 for story. I think the art does a really good job picking everything up, as long as you're patient enough to find it and look through it and just stay on the page long enough. And readability, I'm going to give it a 9 just because I think the readability might actually be too good for what it is. Like, like I said, you can breathe through this, and I think that's a disservice to the comic if you do. If you just go through it. But other than that, it is extremely enjoyable. I actually have always liked Punisher comics most of the time, because I do love the aesthetic of it. It's very realistic. You know, these people will not change; they have to die, type stuff. I do have to say this series gets kind of weird towards the end, and jumps into another series as it gets extremely weird. So be careful on that if someone's going to read this all the way through. But it is a very good 3 issues, and then the 4th issue is still good. But like I said, it's just a jarring hit when you run into
that abrupt stop because where'd it go?
Yeah, and all of a sudden you flip up that page and you're like, why are there Marines in here now? And then you get everything.
And again, the Marine aspect in Punisher is probably my favorite anti-hero. Like, I do have just this weird connection to him that, like, I always just appreciated the character, and I never had a reason to. Like, you really should, but, like, you do. You attach to him very quickly.
Well, he's understandable, I mean, you can understand the Punisher a lot easier than you could Batman, who has, kind of similar situations a little bit. Mm-hmm. Batman's more of an enigma of how he keeps to his code when he sees what he sees.
Right.
Where the Punisher is much more realistic in that he's just like, I'm not going to risk.
Well, it's, people come to comic books to escape a lot of that too. And I'm always surprised why Punisher is so popular, because he is the real life what would happen if somebody watched their family get annihilated by the mob. And you would expect that, like, well, I'm not going to come and read real life. Why would I want to read real life? Like,
well, because it's an escape in a different way.
Right.
It's an escape. It's kind of why humans always, every human will have a thought of killing somebody, even if they'll never do it. I mean, that thought will pop in their head.
Right.
It's a release of that aggression. And I think it does a really good job of doing that.
And
Darth Hoover.
You joke, sir.
I was once called Palpatine at my job, so that
I stand corrected.
Now that our dark time is over, and it is time for Mr. Wilson's pick.
Finally, his nickname will actually make sense.
Yeah, there you go.
Mr. Wilson, tell us why you love Valiant Comics so much.
Yeah, so my pick this week was Ninjak, Volume 1, Weaponeer from 2015, written by Matt Kent, with a combination of art by Butch Geist, Clayman, and Juan Jose Reap. And that's because there are multiple stories within each issue of this, and each one has a different artist. So, in brief, Valiant Comics was relaunched in 2012, and their shared universe is beloved by many, many diehard fans, of which I am one. They are in a different position nowadays, but honestly, what we should probably do sometime, like we will for the Dark Phoenix Saga, Age of Apocalypse, and other things, we should do a Valiant episode. And I can talk about that then, because this one, I want to focus on the comic. This comic book is about a gentleman named Colin King, and he's kind of a combination between Batman and James Bond. And it is very interesting because the writer does a lot with it that's not even necessarily on the page in terms of when an artist were to draw something. And one way that he does that is in the precursor page, or the prelude page, I should say, of each issue. There's 4 issues in this volume. There's a piece of equipment that is part of Ninjak's outfit or his gear that he has accessible. And it's a diagram that points to different aspects of it. I'm just going to read you one this is how he explains the augmented tactile inputs on his gloves. So these are things on his gloves that give him advantages in combat. And this is how they're described. Psych profiles are inconclusive, but reports indicate a lack of true emotional responses to any stimuli. Any quote-unquote feeling shown by subject is thought to be purely artificial. So the writer actually is trying to explain to us that Colin King Ninjak is a little bit of a sociopath and that there's some other issues that he has, but they're doing it by talking about his gear and then actually making it a reflection of his personality. Mm-hmm. So right there, we're in a different realm of comic books. Okay. And then that's not necessarily a realm that everybody loves, because some people would see that and be like, why do I have to read this? That's the diagram for my story. I just want to, but I really enjoy something like that. Also, each story has a main storyline, which is a combination of us seeing Colin's origins as a child and the life that he led as a child, and then also seeing what happens to him later in life when he joins MI6 to become part of their ninja program. Mm-hmm. And their ninja program, he is technically Ninja K, although that is not what he's referred to. The comic is called Ninjak, and he is called Ninjak. That is to be clear. The origin of the original Ninjak in the 1990s was that he was supposed to be a combination between a ninja and Union Jack, and that was atrocious and often regarded as one of the very worst original Valiant comics ever made. But this totally changed that character entirely and was just right in the smack dab of a different era that was just absolutely excellent. So we see three different storylines through this thing from three different artists that all tie together. One is the storyline of young Colin, who is a boy that lives literally in a castle, and his parents are always gone, and he's always just being tended to by this butler person. And in these 4 volumes, all you really learn is that parents don't really care about him and they're never there. You don't know what they do or what they're doing. You learn that later, and I won't spoil that. And that his caretaker guy is somewhat abusive, but that young Colin is not afraid to fight back, to the point where even once for a season, he incapacitates this butler caretaker guy that watches over him, and then goes into the woods and spends the entire autumn, winter, and spring just living out in the woods. And it shows that in like a matter of just a few panels. So there's the young Colin story, and then you have the early 20s, mid 20s story, which is in the present, that is showing when MI6 hired him to go after a group of weapon sellers, like Lord of War type people called the Shadow Seven, and he has to go after one of them. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. It's cool. It's a story that happens in Tokyo, and basically it's one of those, he's undercover and he's got to do a bunch of bad stuff to impress the bad guy, gain his trust, and take over his organization, so then he can be even in deeper cover so that he can dismantle the organization in the long run. That's the gist. And it's a cool story. The third story that's in there is called The Lost Files, which is a couple of pages at the end of each issue. And that's telling you about when Colin first joined MI6. And what's interesting to note in all of this is the Lost Files are directly connected to a character called Roku that he fights in the book as well. Now, just to clarify, Ninjak is a regular guy, as far as you know now in this stage of it. He's a regular guy that trained for a really long time. He had access to a lot of resources, and he became really good and kind of like Batman. But this person that he fights in the beginning named Roku, this enhanced super being that can control every part of her body to the point where she can even like use her hair to attack you, and it's like razor sharp, and she can cause you to combust, and she has the power of suggestion as well. In the beginning of the story, she suggests to these guards in this compound that they need to kill themselves, and as a result of that, they kill themselves instead of fighting her. And so you later find out about her origin story too. There's an entire issue that's about explaining how she became what she is. And if you pay very subtle attention, you see that the woman who's his handler in the Lost Files, that is the person who he falls in love with. He's not supposed to do that. She's like his connection in the spy world, and they're not supposed to fraternize. They end up falling in love, getting together.
If you pay very close attention to the story that's the origin of Roku, it's the same woman. And a lot of people don't get that. That was like something that was really missed when it first came out. And from that point, that gets fleshed out even more. It's really just the introduction to a character. But to me, it's comic book writing on another level because of the depth of what we're talking about and because of the details that are, I mean, you could read this, in my opinion, 5 times, and every time you're going to get something new out of it that's going to give you an idea. In terms of the art, I think that the Clayman art is incredible. That's the main artist. I really, really love him. He would be in one of my top ones too. The rest of the art is pretty good as well, but the Clayman art I love especially. And then the only other thing I would really note about it for me is that it is also something of an action comic. Mm-hmm. And so in the beginning, like you'll have entire panels or entire pages of panels, I should say. You know, you'll have a panel where he's just looking at somebody, then he's prepping a bomb switch, and then he's diving out of the way of something. And the neat part about it, though, is as that's happening, it all feels like a John Woo movie or something because it's just flowing on the page, and you can follow these fights, and it's like you can feel the speed of the fight and the acrobatics of the fight, and there's an entire the panels overlap each other. Like she shoots at him from one angle, and then his arm merges into the panel and then blocks it like that. I'm holding my arm in front of a camera like somebody can see what I'm saying, even though you guys can only hear me. But and I mean, even at one point, this is how crazy it gets. She drops the clip out of her gun, kicks the clip towards him, shoots the clip to make the clip explode. And that's just the kind of stuff that you see. So when you hear British guy in the ninja program, you're like, oh gosh, what is this going to be? But then you see this guy and it's like, wow, yeah, he's pretty good. But it's excellent composition. There are entire panels with no words that just tell the story very well, in my opinion. I am a little biased because this isn't the first time that he appears in this universe. So by the time I got to this book, even though it is his origin story, I had seen him as a member of a team called Unity in another comic where you don't really know his origin story for a while. He's just like a supporting character, but he's a cool one. So I like this a lot, but I can also say that what you learn about his parents and about the butler after this makes you like, oh my God. They're like, oh my gosh moments where you cannot believe where it goes and what the writer does. So I just feel like it's a higher standard of comics on every level, and I super love it. So I would encourage anybody to check it out. My ratings are going to be, I'm going to say 9.5 for a story, just because I think there's some that could confuse somebody or make you have to read it more than once. But I think I really love Matt Kent. And for the art, it's kind of hard because there's 3 artists. Because I would give Clayman a 9.5. I would give both the other artists an 8. And for readability, I would give it a 9.5 because I don't think there's anything in here that, like, you don't need to go read another comic to get it. This is the first introduction of all of this stuff. The only thing that kind of sometimes takes away from it is that the premise is a little dependent on the fact that it's a reboot of something that was lame. And it just makes you wonder, like, well, if they didn't have to stay in the confines of that, would it have been just a little bit better? Anyways, that's me.
Well, it's interesting because, like, again, when we talk about readability and everything, we're kind of defining it as our ability to hand this to someone who doesn't know the universe or doesn't know anything else, and would we recommend it to people and anything else. So for me, being a not so heavy comic book reader, I jump into things and, like, when you're like, oh, these comics are great, and I don't necessarily know the backstory of anything, or like, it's literally first time even touching this universe for the most part. And I go, okay, I really love the story. I really love the artwork. I really love this, that, the other. But sometimes you're willing to go back and reread it just to see if you, like, pick something up again, or, this, that, the other. And I've read this 3 times now because I kept going back and I'm like, oh wait, I didn't quite understand this one aspect when I got to the 3rd comic. So I would go back and kind of go through again, and you're like you said, you pick up something new every time on it by either you're paying attention to a panel more. Even reading it 3 times, it wasn't an overload. It was like, oh, I get to enjoy it again. And so it was really good to me. Like, I really did love this comic. I had asked you, like, because I was getting confused on where he kind of lined up, because I was like, is he a movie actor? Is he this, that, the other?
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, oh, ninja, like, because the British are so well known for their ninjas, you know, like it didn't quite make sense to me. But then once you're like,
Right.
oh no, that's the character. He's not supposed to fall into a category. He's just that good. He is that super spy kind of thing, and that really, like, again, it really brings a lot to the story. And like you had pointed out, the gear pages, and sometimes what's not written on the page is just as important, and it tells a whole lot about like what's going on in the storyline. And so for me, I'm going to say story was a 9.5 again. And art, like you, I'm going to actually give a 10, because I enjoyed when they switched from 3 to 4 and the style changed and then goes back to the, like, so they're at night, they're in the city, something's going on. The style of art changed, so it almost went into that Scanner Darkly kind of art style. But then it goes back and all the color comes back when he's talking to the big sumo guy and this, that, the other. And I thought that told more of a story too, because some people will stay with the same kind of coloring and this, that, the other all through the comic book, but you don't get a message across that way. So when they changed that, you could tell, oh, this is a little bit more serious. This is more nitty gritty. And then the next comic, it lightens up because he's sitting there singing. So the fact that the colors lighten up and there's more color was amazing to me. Again, the portrayal of what the art was saying was very important. And readability, I'm going to give a 10, because I think you could literally hand this to anybody on the street and they're going to enjoy it.
So what you're saying is we don't need to read anything else but Valiant Comics.
Well, we definitely don't need to read any Batman from 2021 or 2021.
Nope, we don't.
Or X-Men from.
So I picked next week.
or
right.
Or X-Men from 95 to 97.
That's a true statement.
You wouldn't be able to read Age of Apocalypse. That's 95, bro.
Oh,
really?
Cell phone. All right, but Mr. Hoover.
So the art, is really, really good at this. I kind of want to pull. I really love the art when they did Roku's backstory. I really liked, from the spike going into basically when she's laying there and her blood's dyeing her hair red, to the colors of her surviving, climbing back up that mountain, fighting, with the ogre thing that she's fighting, and then the Greek guy. Yeah, the art in general was amazing. I do like the fights between her and the main character. I think that the fight, like you were saying, they were extremely dynamic in the way that they did them. They flew amazingly. But yeah, so the art for me is definitely up there. It's definitely, I do have to say I'm kind of with you where it's a 9 out of 10, not because of the main artist, but because of the other two comics. I would say readability. If you only read this once, I could see how you might have a problem at the beginning and go back and read it, because the 3 different stories at once can be a little bit, like, I understood the kid thing right away, but I did have to read the lost chapter again to be like, because also with Valiant, they do the thing where they put other parts of comics in there as kind of like a preview. I had to make sure it was a preview and not part of that comic.
Where they just randomly drop in Bloodshot and you're like, huh?
But other than that, the readability is great. So I would give that 8.5. I would say the story on this, you get the origins, but it's not like you get too much from it. But I think what the story does do a great job is making you want to read more of it. It makes you want to learn more about these characters. Even the part where she's like, I know the smell, and she's doing the stuff. If they didn't do the lost chapter part and you didn't pick that stuff up, that would be another thing that you're like, I would want to know more about. But since you do know about it, you want to see how it progresses a lot more. So it doesn't just hold your interest. It makes you want to continue to read. So I would say the story is a 9.5 out of 10. But like I said, the art and parts, definitely the main art picks up, and it's at some points it almost seems like it could be a beyond a 10 in certain points. I do love the art on this. The only thing I did get a laugh because the first time I saw Ninjak without his stuff, I was like, Archer, is that you? Is that you, bro? But he does look like the generic, like, Englishman, like rich Englishman. But
there's a Valiant character called Archer, so I was...
Oh no, I'm talking about the Archer show. But,
he does look just like Archer.
Yeah.
From you're right.
But I do like,
and he's a spy.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I do like I like a lot of his gizmos. I do like his thought process when he's going through things. I actually love it when comics do that, when they go through the thought process, because it seems that a lot more that it shows a lot more of what the character is capable of. I'm definitely, especially since on Comixology, I think almost quite a bit of this is free. So I will definitely be reading more into this. Just absolutely spectacular all the way through. I also have to say that the metal spike going in the back of Roku's head, that was rather brutal. Jeez.
Yeah.
Not sure how that gave her powers or anything, but it's not explained. Like, stuff like that's not explained. Like, we see what she went through, but we don't really, like, there's a lot of unknowns in this world at this point in time. But that doesn't take away from it at all. If anything, it makes you want to continue.
Almost everything that I'm talking about from that period of time is free on Comixology. Valiant, I think, for a time had a partnership with them, so that's why you can almost read everything through probably 2020 at this point. They use a lot of the same artists. So if you like that grittier Juan Jose Reap art in the Roku story, he does an entire series, many other series for Valiant. So he's really good.
Good to know.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that is a perfect place to wrap up this week. Thank you, everybody, for stopping in. Again, make sure to like, share, and all that. Leave a review.
Thanks so much for joining us tonight, True Believers. If you enjoyed the show, then drop us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Check out our previous episodes by searching for us on YouTube and join the conversation in our Facebook group, Comic Book Hangout. Don't forget our Patreon too, where for just $1, we will shamelessly review any comic or arc of your choice. Alas, the source wall is cracking open, and who knows what's about to pour through. We're getting out of here. Have a great night, and join us next time on Not Another Comic Book Podcast.